December 24th, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The aluminum mess tin trembled in Herman Buker's hands, not from weakness, his wound had healed months ago, but from something far more dangerous than shrapnel. Confusion. Through the barracks window, he watched American townspeople unload boxes from pickup trucks, their breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. Cigarettes, chocolate, Christmas cards decorated with pine trees and stars. For them, for the enemy. Buker set down the tin. The coffee inside had gone cold, but he barely noticed. In his 28 years, he had learned that the world operated according to certain immutable laws. Strength dominated weakness. Victors punished the vanquished. Enemies destroyed each other without mercy. These truths had been hammered into him in the Hitler Youth, reinforced in the Wehrmacht, baptized in blood across North Africa. Yet here, in the scrubland of central Texas, 6,000 miles from the fatherland, those laws were dissolving like morning mist under an unforgiving sun. He had arrived at this moment through a journey that began 18 months earlier in the choking dust of Tunisia, where the Afrika Korps, Rommel's legendary desert warriors, made their final desperate stand against overwhelming Allied forces. April 27, 1943. Jebel Bou Aoukaz, Tunisia. The shell screamed overhead with that particular whistle that separated veterans from corpses, high-pitched, ascending, passing. Buker pressed himself against the rocky outcrop, tasting copper and cordite. Not his shell. Not yet. Unteroffizier Herman Buker commanded 9 men, what remained of his platoon after 3 years of fighting from Tobruk to Kasserine Pass. 9 men from an original 42. They held a worthless hill in a worthless valley, part of the shrinking German-Italian pocket in Tunisia. The mathematics of defeat were simple and brutal. 125,000 Germans and 135,000 Italians trapped against the Mediterranean Sea, facing 250,000 Allied troops with air superiority, naval supremacy, and unlimited ammunition. Buker knew these numbers. Every German soldier knew them. They whispered them in the pre-dawn darkness, calculated them while cleaning weapons, factored them into every tactical decision. The Afrika Korps had achieved miracles before. Improbable victories against superior forces through speed, aggression, and Rommel's tactical genius. But miracles required fuel, ammunition, food. The convoys from Italy had stopped coming. The Luftwaffe had vanished from the skies. Even water was rationed now. Quote, Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann crawled up beside him, uniform caked with the red Tunisian dust that invaded everything. Lungs, weapons, wounds. Quote 1, quote 2, quote. Buker raised his field glasses. Through the shimmering heat distortion, he could see them, tiny figures moving with the casual confidence of men who controlled the battlefield. Behind them, invisible but present as gravity, lay the full weight of British and American industrial might. Buker had seen the photographs in captured Allied newspapers. Factory workers in Detroit and Birmingham, women in coveralls assembling aircraft fuselages, rivers of trucks rolling off production lines. The propaganda ministry called it a Jewish conspiracy, capitalist decadence destined to collapse under National Socialist will. The artillery spotters disappeared behind the ridgeline. 30 seconds later, the first shells arrived. The barrage lasted 7 minutes, an eternity compressed into explosive fragments. The world became noise and pressure, rock splinters and cordite smoke. Buker's ears rang with a high, thin whine that would follow him for years. When silence returned, never true silence, always the groans of wounded men, the trickle of disturbed stones, he counted his survivors. 6 men, 3 dead, including Zimmermann, whose young face now stared sightlessly at the African sky he would never leave. Fall back, Buker ordered. 3rd defensive line. But there was no 3rd defensive line. There were no defensive lines at all, just exhausted men clinging to positions they knew were untenable, waiting for orders that never came or came too late. The command structure had fractured. Field Marshal Rommel had been evacuated to Germany weeks earlier. General von Arnim commanded the remnants, but commanding meant watching the inevitable unfold in slow motion. May 9th, 1943. The ammunition ran out first, then the water. Then, finally, hope. Bucher's platoon, now just 5 men, occupied a dried stream bed 2 kilometers from what intelligence claimed was the new defensive perimeter. They had not eaten in 36 hours. Their last water came from a brackish well guarded by military police, who dispensed it by the cupful. Each man received 1 cup every 12 hours. The American offensive began at 0400 hours with an artillery barrage that turned the darkness incandescent. Buker watched from his shallow scrape in the earth, hypnotized by the mathematical precision of it. Shells walking across the landscape in neat rows, erasing German positions with industrial efficiency. This was not war as he had known it in the desert campaigns of 1941 and 1942, where mobility and audacity could compensate for material disadvantage. This was annihilation through abundance. At 0700 hours, American infantry appeared, not scattered skirmishers, but waves of men advancing behind a rolling barrage with tank support and air cover. Bucher raised his rifle, one of 3 weapons among his 5 men that still had ammunition, and acquired a target. American soldier, perhaps 20 years old, carrying his rifle at port arms. The range was 300 meters. An easy shot. Bucher's finger tightened on the trigger. The shell that found him came from a forward observer who had spotted their position, probably through binoculars identical to the ones Buker had used an hour earlier to watch the American advance. It struck the embankment 2 meters to his left. The blast wave lifted him, spun him, slammed him down. He felt something tear in his left side, hot and wet. When he tried to stand, his leg refused to obey. The battlefield acquired a dreamlike quality. Buker watched his men scatter, or tried to scatter. 2 made it 10 meters. 1 made it 15. The last, Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, the oldest man in the unit at 34, veteran of Poland and France, turned back. "Leave me," Buker said, or thought he said. The words came out garbled. Dietrich ignored him, grabbing Buker's harness and dragging him toward a shell crater. They made it 5 meters before American voices, speaking that harsh, angular English, surrounded them. Quote 7. Dietrich's hands went up. Buker, unable to stand, lay on the ground and waited for the bullet. Wehrmacht training was explicit. Bolsheviks tortured prisoners. The British sent them to India or Canada to rot. The Americans... Propaganda was less clear about the Americans. They were weak, decadent, mongrel. They were also apparently winning. The bullet never came. Instead, hands, surprisingly gentle, rolled him onto a stretcher. An American medic, Red Cross armband vivid against his uniform, pressed gauze against Buker's side. The pain was extraordinary. Buker heard himself scream. Quote 8. The English words meant nothing, but the tone did. It was the tone of a man who had done this before, who knew his job, who treated this bleeding German soldier not as vermin to be eliminated, but as a problem to be solved. Consciousness fragmented. Buker remembered the stretcher-bearers, 2 Negro soldiers, another propaganda impossibility, Negroes in combat positions. He remembered the aid station, a tent city behind American lines where dozens of wounded men lay in rows, and the astonishing fact that German and American wounded received treatment in the same space, in the same order, based on the severity of injuries rather than nationality. He remembered the American surgeon, Captain Somebody, name lost to morphine, who examined his wound with professional detachment. Quote 9. Buker understood none of the words, but he understood luck. In the Afrika Korps, wounded men waited days for treatment. Infections killed more soldiers than bullets. Morphine existed only in rumors. Yet here he lay, enemy soldier, receiving immediate surgical intervention in a field hospital that smelled of antiseptic and efficiency rather than gangrene and despair. The operation lasted 90 minutes. When Buker woke, his side was bandaged, his pain had receded to a dull throb, and his war was over. May 13, 1943. The German-Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered. 260,000 men laid down their weapons and became prisoners of war. The number was staggering, more than the Germans lost at Stalingrad, though the propaganda ministry would never admit that comparison. Among those hundreds of thousands, Herman Buker was a single data point. Unteroffizier. 28 years old, Nazi party member since 1937, true believer in the Thousand-Year Reich. The Americans processed them with assembly line efficiency, name, rank, serial number, medical examination, delousing, clean uniform, American uniform, olive drab, with PWD stenciled on the back. Prisoner of War Department, 3 meals a day, shelter, medical care. It was, Buker thought with dull confusion, better treatment than he had received as a soldier in the Wehrmacht. May 21st through June 4th, 1943. Mediterranean Sea and Atlantic Ocean. They packed 500 German prisoners into the hold of a Liberty ship, one of those mass-produced American cargo vessels that rolled off shipyards at the rate of 3 per day. The Germans knew this statistic because American guards told them casually, the way one might mention the weather. 3 ships per day. The number was obscene. Germany's entire maritime construction capacity could not match what a single American shipyard produced in a month. The crossing took 14 days. 14 days in the metal bowels of a ship, where men vomited and prayed and contemplated the supreme irony. They were German prisoners being transported across the Atlantic, where German U-boats hunted Allied shipping. If a torpedo found this ship, they would drown by the hundreds, killed by their own Kriegsmarine. No torpedo came. Buker spent the crossing in a cramped berth with 5 other non-commissioned officers. They came from different units, different regions, different backgrounds, but they shared the same crushing bewilderment. They had lost. The Afrika Korps, unconquered across 2 years of desert warfare, had been erased. And now they were sailing toward America, mythical, distant America, as cargo. The conversations in that hold revealed the fragmentation of faith. Some men clung to victory like drowning swimmers to wreckage. Germany was developing miracle weapons, they insisted, jet aircraft, rockets, bombs of unprecedented power. The Führer would never surrender. This was temporary defeat, strategic repositioning. Others had glimpsed the truth. Obergefreiter Werner Schaffer, a tank driver from Stuttgart, spoke the heresy quietly, in darkness. We cannot win. Have you seen what they have? The trucks? The tanks? The aircraft? We are fighting with 19th century production against 20th century industry. Defeatist talk, someone hissed. Traitor. Realist talk, Schaffer replied. Count the ships in the Mediterranean. Count the aircraft in the sky. Count the shells they fire in a single barrage. Then count ours. Mathematics does not lie, even when Goebbels does. The argument died unresolved, but Buker noticed something. No one reported Schaffer. No one invoked discipline or demanded punishment. The internal mechanisms of Nazi conformity, so powerful in Germany, had loosened in the ship's hold, perhaps because they were all prisoners now. Perhaps because 6,000 kilometers from home, propaganda lost its power against observed reality. June 4th, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. America announced itself through abundance. The prisoners disembarked in morning light, blinking in the glare off Chesapeake Bay. They had expected chaos. Weren't Americans disorganized? Inefficient? Instead, they found order. Tables arranged in rows, medical personnel conducting examinations, clerks processing paperwork, guards maintaining security without brutality, and food. The Americans fed them immediately, not starvation rations, not watery soup and black bread, but actual meals, scrambled eggs, bacon, white bread, coffee with real sugar. Buker stared at his plate and calculated. This single meal contained more calories and protein than a Wehrmacht soldier received in 2 days. Propaganda, muttered Lieutenant Friedrich Koch, a artillery officer who had appointed himself the ranking prisoner and therefore guardian of ideological purity. They are fattening us up for photographs. But there were no photographs. There were only American soldiers, many looking bored, distributing food to prisoners with the same indifference cafeteria workers showed to factory employees. This was not special treatment. This was routine. After processing, they loaded onto trains, American trains, diesel locomotives pulling dozens of cars, smooth tracks, no bomb damage. The journey southwest took 3 days. 3 days watching America slide past the windows, vast farmland, industrial cities, forests untouched by artillery, bridges standing intact. The countryside showed no evidence of war, no craters, no ruins, no refugees. It was as if the global conflict consuming Europe and Asia existed in another dimension, invisible from this peaceful, prosperous landscape. They passed through towns where children waved at the train, not knowing or caring that it carried enemy soldiers. They saw highways filled with civilian automobiles, private cars, hundreds of them, burning gasoline for recreation while the Wehrmacht rationed fuel drop by drop. They observed industrial plants running at full capacity, smokestacks breathing prosperity into cloudless skies. Lieutenant Koch maintained his brittle confidence. Strategic deception. They show us the rich areas. America has poverty too. Negroes living in slums. Workers exploited by Jewish capitalists. But Buker, watching the endless abundance roll past, felt the first tremors of doubt. Not conscious doubt. Not yet. Just a question forming in the back of his mind. If this was deception, if this was facade, then what resources had they deployed to create such an elaborate illusion? And if it required such resources merely to deceive prisoners, what did that say about American capacity for actual war production? June 7, 1943, Hearne, Texas. The camp occupied 720 acres of flat Texas scrubland, 8 miles from the small town of Hearne, population 3,500. The Americans had built it in 6 months. Barracks, mess halls, hospitals, recreation facilities, guard towers, water systems, sewage treatment. The construction timeline was impossible by German standards, yet here it stood. A complete military installation materialized from nothing. Buker was among the first wave of prisoners to arrive. 3,000 men, mostly Afrika Korps veterans, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men. They marched through the gates under June heat that felt like Tunisia's furnace and discovered their new world. The barracks were wooden structures, simple but weatherproof. Each man received a bed, an actual bed with mattress and sheets, plus locker space for personal items. There were showers with hot water, latrines that functioned, a camp library, sports fields, even a canteen where prisoners could purchase small luxuries using scrip earned through labor. The Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment of prisoners of war. Buker had known this intellectually. But experiencing it, living in conditions superior to many German military barracks, eating regular meals, receiving medical care, created cognitive dissonance that no amount of ideological training could resolve. The camp's internal organization followed German military hierarchy. Captured officers and senior NCOs maintained their rank structure. They conducted formations, enforced discipline, organized educational programs. This included political education. Lieutenant Koch and others like him, convinced Nazis who viewed captivity as temporary interruption, ran informal indoctrination sessions, reminding prisoners of their duty to the fatherland and the Führer. Buker attended these sessions. He spoke the correct words, made the correct gestures, maintained the correct facade. But the doubt was growing. September 19, 1943. Buker, you are assigned to the work detail at Alcoa. Report to the gate at 0500 tomorrow. The guard, Sergeant Miller, a middle-aged man from Houston who spoke fractured German learned from his immigrant grandparents, delivered the order without ceremony. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men and non-commissioned officers could be compelled to work. Officers could not. Buker had mixed feelings. Work meant leaving the camp's psychological pressure cooker, where Nazi loyalists monitored everyone for signs of weakness or treason. It also meant encountering more of America, which had become both fascinating and threatening. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, 40 miles from Camp Hearn, operated 24 hours daily, feeding America's voracious appetite for aircraft aluminum. The United States produced 60,000 aircraft in 1943 alone. 60,000. Germany managed 25,000. The mathematics of industrial warfare were becoming impossible to ignore. 30 German prisoners, including Buker, were assigned to the recycling section. Their job was simple: collect aluminum scrap from the production floor, sort it by alloy type, prepare it for remelting. Menial work. Unskilled labor, the kind of task any warm body could perform. What Buker saw in that plant destroyed something fundamental in his worldview. The scrap. Dear God, the scrap. In German factories, workers collected metal shavings with magnets. They swept floors for dropped rivets. They accounted for every gram of aluminum because Germany's bauxite supplies, requisitioned from occupied France and Hungary, were limited and precious. Aluminum meant aircraft. Aircraft meant air superiority. Air superiority meant survival. At Alcoa, American workers threw away more aluminum in a single 8-hour shift than Buker's entire Luftwaffe wing had received in a month. Rejected castings piled 3 meters high. Slightly imperfect extrusions went straight to scrap bins. Cutting waste, the material trimmed to achieve precise dimensions, accumulated in drums that forklift operators carted away every few hours. Buker stood amid this abundance, surrounded by metal that would have been worth its weight in gold in Germany, and performed mental calculations. This one plant in this one town in this one state wasted more aluminum daily than his entire nation could mine and process. If that was true for one plant, and there were hundreds of plants, and this was just aluminum, just one material among many, the mathematics were apocalyptic. Hey, Fritz, you going to sort that scrap or just stare at it? The speaker was Joe Kowalski, a foreman in his 50s, Polish immigrant who had come to Texas during the oil boom of the 1920s. He supervised the German work detail with casual indifference, treating them neither as enemies nor friends, but as temporary employees. Yes, sorry, sorting now. Buker's English had improved through necessity. The camp offered classes, American instructors teaching German prisoners to speak English, another Geneva Convention requirement. The irony was not lost on anyone. The enemy was educating them. Kowalski watched him work for a moment. Quote 21. Quote 22. Quote 23. Kowalski spat tobacco juice into a can. Quote 24. This casual cynicism, this open criticism of the war effort while standing in a war production facility, violated every assumption Buker held about society. In Germany, such talk invited the Gestapo. Here, nobody even looked up. Quote 25. Kowalski shrugged. Quote 26. A supervisor would have reported him. A political officer would have arrested him. In Texas, his words vanished into the plant's industrial roar, consequence-free. Buker returned to sorting scrap, but his hands moved automatically now. His mind grappled with implications that grew more disturbing by the hour. If Americans could criticize their leadership publicly without fear, if workers could waste resources without punishment, if this chaotic, undisciplined society could still produce such overwhelming material superiority, then what did that say about National Socialism's supposed efficiency? What did it say about the Führer's promises of inevitable victory? The questions were dangerous. Thinking them felt like treason. But he could not stop. October through December, 1943. Work at the Alcoa plant became Buker's education in American reality. Each shift revealed new contradictions to German propaganda. The workers, Buker had expected to find the exploited proletariat that Nazi ideology promised. Instead, he encountered men and women who owned houses, drove automobiles, sent their children to school, complained about taxes, and criticized the government without fear. They were not rich. Kowalski lived in a modest home on the edge of Rockdale, but they possessed a standard of living that German industrial workers could not imagine. During lunch breaks, German prisoners sat in a designated area. Quote 27. Kowalski called it without malice and ate meals provided by the plant cafeteria. American workers ate in the same cafeteria, from the same menu. Buker watched them discard food casually. A half-eaten sandwich, an unwanted apple, coffee poured down the drain, food waste. The concept was obscene to men from a nation where every citizen received ration cards and black markets flourished. Quote 28. Lieutenant Koch observed during one lunch break. He had been assigned to a different work detail, but maintained his ideological vigilance across the camp. Quote 29. But others were less certain. Werner Schaefer, the tank driver who had spoken heresy on the ship, had been working at a cotton gin near Bryan, Texas. Quote 30, he said quietly. Quote 31 and quote 32, Koch snapped. Quote 33, quote 34, Schaefer replied. Quote 35. The argument reflected larger fractures developing within the prisoner population. Some men, the Alte Kämpfer, old fighters, ideological core, clung to Nazi faith with desperate intensity. They held secret meetings, enforced loyalty tests, punished suspected traitors. Others began the slow, agonizing process of reconsidering everything they had been taught. Buker existed in the middle, paralyzed by conflicting evidence. He wanted to believe. Faith in the Führer, in National Socialism, in ultimate German victory, had sustained him through 3 years of combat. Abandoning that faith meant admitting he had fought for lies, killed for illusions, sacrificed his youth for a cause that was not merely losing, but fundamentally wrong. The psychological cost of such admission was nearly unbearable. December 15, 1943. Rumors swept through Camp Hearn like winter wind across Texas scrubland. The town of Hearn was organizing something for Christmas. The details were vague, but the prisoners buzzed with speculation during evening formations. Quote 36. Lieutenant Koch declared. Quote 37. Buker said nothing. He had learned that silence was safest. The camp had become a pressure cooker of competing loyalties, where speaking incorrectly, expressing too much enthusiasm for American treatment or insufficient faith in German victory, could mark a man as defeatist, traitor, candidate for informal punishment by the Loyalist faction. The violence was real. 2 months earlier, Corporal Hugo Kraus, who worked as a translator for the American administration, had been found dead in the latrine. Officially, it was an accident, a fall, a broken neck. Unofficially, everyone knew. Kraus had made pro-American statements, had expressed admiration for democracy, had questioned the Führer's infallibility. The Loyalists had eliminated him as an example. Buker kept his questions internal, but they multiplied daily. December 24, 1943. Morning. The trucks arrived at 0800 hours, civilian vehicles, pickup trucks mostly, driven by residents of Hearn, Texas, population 3,500, a town barely large enough to deserve a dot on the map. They parked outside the main gate and began unloading boxes. The prisoners assembled for morning formation could see them clearly. American families, mothers, fathers, elderly grandparents, carrying cardboard boxes toward the administrative building. The boxes were decorated with Christmas ribbons, red and green and gold. "What is this?" someone muttered. "I told you," Koch said triumphantly. "Propaganda. They staged this for cameras." But there were no cameras, no reporters, no official ceremony, just townspeople delivering boxes and leaving, some staying to talk with camp administrators, others departing quickly as if embarrassed by their own generosity. After formation, word spread. The boxes contained Christmas gifts for the prisoners, from the people of Hearn. The announcement met stunned silence. At 1300 hours, the distribution began. Each prisoner received a small package, wrapped simply, containing 1 pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, 2 Hershey chocolate bars, a bar of soap, a handkerchief, a Christmas card. Buker took his package with trembling hands. He opened the Christmas card carefully. Inside, handwritten in English, "Merry Christmas from the Williams family. We pray for peace and your safe return home." The Williams family, people he had never met, Americans, the enemy, whose sons might be fighting Germans in Italy at this very moment, who chose to spend their limited wartime resources, cigarettes were rationed, chocolate was scarce, on captured Wehrmacht soldiers. He sat on his bunk and stared at the card for a long time. Around him, other prisoners grappled with the same cognitive dissonance. Some laughed it off. Clever propaganda, nothing more. Others grew quiet, retreating into private thoughts that could not be safely shared. A few wept, though they hid their tears. Lieutenant Koch made his rounds, reinforcing the party line. This changes nothing. They are soft, sentimental. This is weakness, not strength. Germany respects power, not charity. When we return home, we will remember who showed true steel. But that night, when darkness covered the barracks and men whispered in the privacy of their bunks, Buker heard different voices. My mother cannot afford cigarettes. We have ration cards for everything. Yet these Americans, whose country is also at war, give to us? In Poland, we took everything. In France, we requisitioned food while civilians starved. What have these people taken from us? They feed us, shelter us, give us Christmas gifts. I do not understand. This is not how enemies behave. Buker lay awake, the chocolate bar unopened beside him. The card's simple message echoed endlessly. We pray for peace and your safe return home. Return home. To what? A Germany that was losing, whose cities were burning under Allied bombing, whose armies retreated on every front? A 1,000-year Reich that would not survive 5 years? Or was that defeatist thinking? Was he falling victim to American psychological warfare, subtle and insidious, designed to break German will through kindness rather than cruelty? He did not know, could not know. The certainty that had carried him through 3 years of combat had dissolved, replaced by questions that multiplied like fractures in stressed metal. January through May, 1944. The transformation was not instantaneous. Buker did not experience a single moment of revelation that shattered his beliefs. Instead, his faith in National Socialism crumbled gradually. Worn away by accumulated observations like water eroding stone, work at the Alcoa plant continued. Each shift reinforced the same devastating conclusion. America possessed industrial capacity that Germany could never match. Buker watched American production methods, assembly line efficiency, interchangeable parts, mechanization replacing human labor, and understood why the Luftwaffe vanished from European skies. German craftsmen still built aircraft one at a time, each plane requiring skilled workers and weeks of labor. American factories stamped out bombers like cookies, mixing mass production with acceptable quality, choosing quantity over perfection because quantity won wars. The numbers were obscene. By mid-1944, the United States was producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one complete aircraft, fighter or bomber, every 5 minutes, 24 hours daily, from dozens of factories across the continent. Germany's entire annual production equaled what America built in 6 weeks. Buker mentioned these observations to no one. The camp had become dangerous for men with doubts. The Loyalist faction, led by officers and hardened Nazis, enforced ideological conformity through violence. They held secret courts, tried prisoners for defeatism, administered beatings in midnight darkness. Hugo Kraus's death had not been an isolated incident. Other prisoners, those who spoke too favorably of American treatment, who questioned German victory, who expressed interest in democracy, suffered accidents, unexplained injuries, deadly falls. So Buker became a master of concealment. He attended the political education sessions and nodded at appropriate moments. He joined in singing Deutschland über alles and maintained the fiction of unshakable faith. Outwardly, he remained a loyal soldier of the Reich, waiting for Germany's inevitable triumph. Inwardly, he was dying. The camp's re-education program began in earnest in spring 1944. American military intelligence, working with German refugees and anti-Nazi academics, developed materials designed to introduce prisoners to democratic principles. They showed films, documentaries about American government, about free elections, about constitutional rights. They distributed newspapers and magazines that German prisoners could read in supervised settings. The hardcore Nazis boycotted these programs and threatened prisoners who attended. But others, hungry for information, desperate to understand the world beyond German propaganda, participated cautiously. Buker attended one screening. The film showed the American electoral process, citizens voting for local and national leaders, peaceful transfer of power, politicians debating in Congress. The narrator explained concepts that seemed alien: checks and balances, separation of powers, freedom of the press, habeas corpus. Watching this film, Buker realized he had never voted for anything in his life. Hitler had been appointed chancellor through backroom deals, then seized absolute power through emergency decrees and intimidation. The Reichstag had become a rubber stamp. Opposition parties were banned. Elections were plebiscites where citizens voted yes or faced consequences. This was normal to Buker. This was how government worked. The Führer led, the people obeyed, and society functioned through hierarchy and discipline. But what if it did not have to be that way? What if these Americans, these supposedly weak and decadent people, had discovered a different system, one that produced greater prosperity, greater innovation, greater power than authoritarianism ever could? The question was heretical. Thinking it felt like betrayal. Buker left the screening in turmoil, angry at the Americans for planting such seeds, angry at himself for being susceptible. August 6, 1944. The work detail returned from Alcoa under late afternoon sun. Buker climbed down from the truck, his uniform soaked with sweat, his mind occupied with the same exhausting questions that plagued him constantly now. A guard met them at the gate, face grim. Quote 46. The prisoners assembled on the parade ground, 3,000 men in rough columns. Camp Commandant Colonel Jameson stood on a platform, his expression carefully neutral. Quote 47. Jameson's German was adequate, learned during 2 years administering POW camps. I have news from Europe. Yesterday, Allied forces landed in Normandy, France. The invasion succeeded. We have established a permanent beachhead. The liberation of Europe has begun. Silence greeted this announcement. Then chaos, some prisoners cheering, others shouting denials, scuffles breaking out between believers and skeptics. Lies, Lieutenant Cox screamed. American propaganda. Germany's Atlantic Wall is impregnable. But Jameson produced newspapers. American papers, British papers, even captured German papers, with photographs of landing craft, of troops wading through surf, of tanks rolling inland. The evidence was overwhelming. That night, the camp divided into armed camps. The Loyalists retreated into rigid denial. This was temporary, a setback. Germany would counterattack and throw the Allies back into the sea. Others saw the writing on the wall. The war was lost. Defeat was inevitable. Only the timeline remained uncertain. Buker lay in his bunk and performed calculations. Germany now fought on 3 fronts: the Soviets advancing from the east, the Americans and British invading from the west, and Allied bombers destroying German cities from above. The mathematics were terminal. No amount of willpower or ideological purity could overcome such overwhelming force. If Germany was losing, was lost, then everything Buker had believed, everything he had fought for, everything he had justified to himself, was built on lies. The psychological implications were crushing. How many men had he killed in North Africa? Not theoretical enemies on distant battlefields, but specific human beings whose faces he remembered, whose deaths he had caused in service to a regime that was not merely losing, but fundamentally evil. Because the re-education materials also included information about concentration camps, about systematic murder, about the industrial elimination of entire populations. The Americans presented this information carefully without sensationalism, using captured German documents and photographs. The Loyalists dismissed it as Jewish propaganda, Allied lies designed to break German morale. But Buker remembered things. Whispered conversations in Wehrmacht barracks, orders to avoid asking questions about certain rail transports, the SS units that operated independently, doing work that regular soldiers did not discuss. He had not known details, had not wanted to know. Willful ignorance provided comfortable deniability, but ignorance was no longer sustainable. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The Thousand-Year Reich lasted 12 years. The war in Europe ended with German cities in ruins, German armies destroyed, German territory occupied by foreign powers. At Camp Herne, the announcement produced stunned silence. Even the Loyalists had no response. The fiction could not be maintained any longer. Some prisoners wept. Others stared blankly. A few attempted celebration before guards reminded them that this was not a moment for joy. Millions were dead, Europe was devastated, and everyone had lost something irreplaceable. Buker walked to the camp's perimeter and looked east, toward Europe, toward Germany, toward a home that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. He thought about the man he had been 3 years earlier, confident, certain, proud. That man was dead, killed not by bullets, but by accumulated evidence that his entire worldview had been constructed on lies. The Americans would eventually repatriate them, send them back to Germany. But to what? A defeated nation, physically destroyed and morally bankrupt. A population that would spend generations grappling with guilt and complicity. A future uncertain in every dimension. Buker had no idea who he was anymore. The Nazi ideology that defined him had collapsed, but nothing had replaced it yet. He existed in limbo, a man without identity, waiting to discover what would grow in the ruins. June through December, 1945. The repatriation process moved slowly. America held more than 375,000 German prisoners of war, scattered across 500 camps in 45 states. They could not all be shipped home simultaneously. Priority went to officers, then to prisoners deemed least politically contaminated by Nazi ideology. Buker remained at Camp Herne through summer and fall. The work details continued. American farmers still needed labor, factories still required workers, but the psychological atmosphere changed. With Germany defeated, maintaining military discipline and Nazi ideology became pointless. The hardcore Loyalists lost power. Prisoners began speaking openly about what they had seen, what they had learned, what they now believed. A new program emerged, Education for Democracy. American instructors working with anti-Nazi German refugees taught courses on democratic governance, free market economics, civil liberties. Rule of law. Attendance was voluntary but well attended. Prisoners who would return to Germany wanted to understand the system that had defeated them and would now occupy their homeland. Buker attended every class. He studied voraciously, reading American newspapers and books, watching films about constitutional government and market capitalism. He was learning not just about democracy, but about thinking itself, about questioning assumptions, examining evidence, changing opinions when facts contradicted beliefs. This was perhaps America's greatest gift, demonstrating that changing one's mind was not weakness but wisdom. The camp's internal dynamics transformed. Men who had hidden their doubts now spoke openly. Conversations that would have earned beatings 6 months earlier happened freely in the mess hall. Prisoners debated Germany's future. Should it be partitioned or unified? Agricultural or industrial? How could Germans prevent another Hitler? Werner Schaffer, the tank driver who had questioned German production capacity on the ship from Afrika, became an informal leader of democratic-minded prisoners. Quote 51, he insisted during evening discussions. Quote 52. These were painful questions with no easy answers. Some prisoners resisted them. Quote 53. But others, including Buker, rejected such convenient evasions. They had eyes. They had brains. They had chosen not to see, not to think, not to question. That choice had consequences measured in millions of dead. December 24, 1945. 2 years after receiving his first Christmas package, Buker sat in the same barracks, holding a new package from the people of Herne. The tradition had continued through both years of his imprisonment. The town's residents, these inexplicable Americans who fed their enemies and prayed for their safe return, kept giving. This year's package contained cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and another handwritten card. This one read, Quote 54. Bucher opened the chocolate and shared it with his barracks mates. They ate slowly, savoring sweetness and contemplating uncertain futures. Quote 55. Someone asked. Quote 56. Quote 57. Buker tested the word. Quote 58. Quote 59. Quote 60. The answer came without hesitation. Quote 61. Others nodded. Not everyone. Some prisoners would return to Germany and continue believing Nazi lies, would claim they knew nothing, would resist change. But enough had transformed. Enough had learned. Perhaps that was America's real victory, not just military conquest, but ideological transformation. They had taken fanatic Nazi soldiers and shown them, through actions more than words, that another way existed, a way that produced abundance without tyranny, victory without cruelty, power without absolutism. December 28, 1945. The final prisoners departed Camp Herne. Buker stood in line with 200 men, waiting to board trucks that would take them to the port of embarkation. Behind them, the camp that had housed nearly 5,000 German prisoners over 30 months stood empty. The Americans would dismantle it, salvage the lumber, erase the infrastructure, return the land to farming. In a few years, only aerial photographs would prove Camp Herne had existed at all. Buker carried little. One small bag with his few possessions, the clothes on his back, and the Christmas cards from the Williams family, carefully folded and preserved. He did not know if he would ever meet them. Probably not. They were ordinary people who had done an extraordinary thing, shown mercy to enemies, and then returned to their ordinary lives. But their impact was permanent. Buker was a different man than the one who had arrived in June 1943. That man was dead, killed by accumulated evidence that his beliefs were lies. What remained was uncertain, unformed, but potentially better. The truck convoy departed at 0900 hours. Buker looked back at Camp Herne, watching it recede into distance. He thought about everything he had seen in 30 months. American abundance, American freedom, American generosity. He thought about aluminum scrap and Christmas gifts and farmers who criticized their president without fear. He thought about the choices ahead, how to live in defeated Germany, how to rebuild not just buildings but values, how to prevent the next Hitler from exploiting the next crisis. The answers were unclear. But for the first time in his adult life, Buker understood that not having answers was acceptable, that uncertainty was preferable to false certainty. That doubt was healthier than blind faith. The convoy rolled east, toward the port, toward the ship that would carry them home. Behind them, the Texas sun rose higher, burning away morning mist, illuminating a landscape untouched by war. Herman Buker returned to Germany in January 1946. He found his hometown of Dusseldorf 70% destroyed by Allied bombing. His family home was rubble. His parents had survived but lived in a refugee camp. His younger brother had died on the Eastern Front in 1944. He spent the next years in reconstruction, physical and moral. He worked in rebuilding efforts, clearing rubble, laying foundations for new buildings. He participated in democratic institutions as they slowly took root in occupied Germany. He joined political discussions advocating for the values he had learned in Texas: freedom of speech, rule of law, checks on power, protection of minorities. The transformation of Germany was neither quick nor easy. Millions of Germans resisted confronting their complicity. The Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle of the 1950s, created prosperity, but also allowed collective amnesia about recent past. Many Germans preferred not to remember, not to question, not to examine. But others, like Buker, insisted on memory and examination. They understood. Forgetting enabled repetition. Only by confronting the truth about National Socialism, its appeal, its crimes, its ultimate failure, could Germany prevent its return. Buker never returned to America, But he carried America with him, the memory of abundance without tyranny, victory without cruelty, power without absolutism. He kept the Christmas cards from the Williams family in a desk drawer, taking them out occasionally to remember that moment in December 1943 when the world stopped making sense and, in that senselessness, began to reveal a deeper truth. In 1978, a historian conducting research on German POWs in America interviewed Buker, now 63 years old and preparing for retirement. The historian asked about his experience at Camp Herne, about his transformation from Nazi true believer to democratic advocate. Buker considered the question for a long moment. Then he pulled out the faded Christmas cards and spread them on the table. "These people," he said slowly, "whose sons and husbands were fighting Germans, whose resources were stretched by war, who had every reason to hate us, they gave us Christmas gifts, not for propaganda, not for advantage, simply because they believed in human dignity, even for enemies." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That single act of mercy destroyed everything I believed about the world. Not immediately, not obviously, but it planted a seed of doubt, and doubt, given water and sunlight, grows into wisdom." The historian asked if he had ever tried to contact the Williams family. "No," Buker admitted. "I do not know if they survived the war, if they still live in Herne, if they remember the German prisoners they gave gifts to. Perhaps it is better this way. They were not heroes seeking recognition. They were ordinary people doing what they believed was right. That is the most powerful lesson of all. Goodness does not require greatness. It requires only choice." The interview concluded. The historian published it in an academic journal that few people read. Buker died in 1984 at age 69, having lived long enough to see Germany reunified and democracy firmly established. His obituary mentioned his military service in North Africa, his capture, his later work in Reconstruction. It did not mention Christmas 1943 or aluminum scrap or the gradual collapse of certainty that transforms lives. But those who knew him best understood. Herman Buker's real war began not in Tunisia, but in Texas. The battles he fought there, internal, psychological, moral, shaped him more profoundly than any combat. He arrived at Camp Herne as a Nazi soldier. He left as a man beginning to understand that strength lies not in domination, but in dignity, not in certainty, but in questioning, not in hatred, but in the difficult, uncomfortable work of extending mercy, even to enemies. That understanding, hard-won and dearly bought, was America's true gift to Herman Buker. Not victory, not freedom, but the possibility, terrifying and liberating, of becoming someone new. Author's note: this narrative is based on the documented experiences of German prisoners of war held at Camp Herne, Texas, during World War II. While Herman Buker is a composite character representing common experiences of Afrika Korps veterans in American captivity, the historical details, the Christmas gift drive organized by Herne residents, the work details at Alcoa and other Texas facilities, the observation of American abundance by prisoners raised under scarcity, the internal violence between Nazi loyalists and prisoners undergoing ideological transformation, and the long-term impact of this experience on German attitudes toward democracy are drawn from historical records, interviews, and archives. Camp Herne operated from June 1943 to December 1945, housing nearly 5,000 prisoners. The site is now farmland, marked only by a historical marker and the memories of those whose lives intersected there during a brief but transformative period.